In the early years of World War II, Spain found itself recovering from a brutal civil war that had torn the nation apart. Led by General Francisco Franco, the country was economically fragile and politically cautious, maintaining a stance of neutrality as the world plunged into chaos. Yet, Spain's geographical position and its ties with fascist Italy and Nazi Germany made it a tempting potential ally for the Axis powers. But what if Spain had decided to join the war? How might Europe's history have changed if Franco had thrown his support behind Hitler and Mussolini? In this alternate scenario, Spain's entry could have reshaped the balance of power in the Mediterranean, challenging British control and altering the course of the conflict in ways that could echo through history. Today, we explore a world where Spain didn't sit on the sidelines, but instead became a key player in World War II. Despite Spain's alignment with fascist ideologies, General Francisco Franco was hesitant to commit his country to a world war. Spain's economy was fragile, and its people were still reeling from the devastation of the recent civil war. Franco knew that another conflict could stretch his resources to the breaking point and potentially destabilize his regime. Furthermore, the German WWII chief, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, secretly discouraged Franco from joining the Axis, subtly suggesting that Germany's ambitions would lead to an inevitable clash with the Soviet Union, a battle Canaris suspected Germany might lose. Franco also demanded substantial economic and military aid from Germany, knowing Spain lacked the resources to wage a prolonged war. When Germany balked at these demands and refused Franco's territorial aspirations in North Africa, the Spanish leader ultimately chose caution. This decision would shape Spain's wartime role and keep the nation on the periphery of the conflict. Had Spain entered World War II in 1940 following the fall of France, the strategic landscape of Europe would have shifted dramatically in favor of the Axis powers. Franco's forces, numbering over 500,000 men, could have collaborated with German troops to launch a coordinated assault on Gibraltar, one of the British Empire's most vital choke points. Capturing Gibraltar would not only cut off Allied supply lines into the Mediterranean, but also grant Axis naval forces control over this critical maritime route. With Spain's coastline providing a strategic advantage, the establishment of U-boat bases on its shores and in Portugal could have significantly increased threats to Allied convoys crossing the Atlantic. The British would have faced greater risks in resupplying their forces in North Africa and maintaining lines of communication with the Middle East, potentially leading to severe shortages. In this scenario, the Axis could have executed a multifaceted campaign in the Mediterranean, disrupting British naval operations and encouraging further Axis expansion into North Africa. The fall of Gibraltar would have transformed the Mediterranean into an Axis lake, complicating Allied military strategy and stretching their resources even thinner across multiple fronts. Spain's entry into World War II on the side of the Axis would have significant repercussions for neighboring Portugal. Historically, Portugal maintained a position of neutrality, but the shifting tides of war could have compelled it to reconsider its stance. Faced with the prospect of a Spanish attack, Portugal might have been forced to ally with the British, creating a united front against the Axis. This alliance would likely trigger a swift and concerted Allied response. British forces could stage an amphibious landing in Portugal, aiming to prevent a potential Axis takeover of the Iberian Peninsula. However, the immediate threat of Spain's military might, combined with German support, could lead to fierce resistance. With Spain's strategic ports now under Axis control, Allied logistics would become increasingly complicated, making it difficult to supply troops and sustain operations. The loss of Portugal would also jeopardize Britain's access to vital resources from Africa and South America, intensifying the already dire situation in the Mediterranean. Allied leaders would need to reevaluate their military strategies, potentially diverting resources from other fronts to fortify defenses in the region. The overall impact of Spain's involvement in the war would thus reshape the balance of power, prompting a dramatic shift in the dynamics of the conflict in Europe and beyond. If the Allies launched an invasion of Spain, the challenges would be manifold. The difficult terrain of the Spanish landscape would complicate military operations, But with resources stretched thin from fighting on multiple fronts, Spain's ability to resist would be severely limited. As Allied forces advanced, Spain would likely struggle to hold back the full might of the Western Allies, facing logistical issues and the threat of a swift military collapse. In this scenario, Spain's downfall could resemble Italy's experience. Both nations were ideologically aligned with the Axis, yet faced stark realities on the battlefield. Spain, burdened by its recent civil war and lacking industrial strength, might fold under pressure even more quickly than Italy did. With Spain officially in the conflict, Iberia could become a significant yet secondary front, diverting German resources away from other critical areas of engagement. This shift would force Germany to allocate troops and supplies to defend its southern flank, ultimately impacting the broader war effort across Europe. The consequences of Spain's involvement in World War II would reverberate throughout the Mediterranean and significantly impact the North African campaign. With Gibraltar in Axis hands, Allied supply lines would be severely disrupted, forcing convoys to reroute through longer, more perilous paths. The loss of this strategic point would allow Axis naval forces to dominate the Mediterranean, creating an environment where resupplying British troops in North Africa becomes increasingly untenable. As a result, the British campaign against Axis forces in North Africa would face dire challenges. With the addition of Spanish resources and potentially more Italian reinforcements, the Axis could launch a more coordinated offensive, further stretching British forces already engaged in combat. This scenario could lead to the Axis achieving greater territorial gains in North Africa, threatening not only British control of the region, but also the vital oil supplies from the Middle East. The outcome of the war might hinge on this critical theater, altering the course of the conflict. Spain's involvement in World War II could have significantly delayed Germany's plans for the Eastern Front. With increased military commitments in Iberia to secure their southern flank, resources and troops diverted from the planned Operation Barbarossa would inevitably postpone the invasion of the Soviet Union. This delay might have provided the Soviets crucial time to bolster their defenses, potentially altering the dynamics of the Eastern Front. Moreover, a postponed invasion could have influenced German-Soviet relations, allowing Stalin to strengthen his position and prepare for conflict more effectively. The outcome might have shifted the timeline of the war in the East, creating a scenario where the Soviet Union could mount a more robust resistance against German advances, fundamentally changing the course of the war. In this alternative timeline, if the war in Europe had evolved into a prolonged stalemate, the Allies might have been compelled to resort to atomic bombs to break the deadlock, especially in the absence of a successful second front in France. As the conflict dragged on, both sides could find themselves at a critical juncture where the stakes became increasingly dire. Germany, facing devastation from relentless Allied bombing campaigns, might retaliate with chemical weapons, such as sarin gas, targeting British cities in an attempt to instill fear and assert dominance. The horrifying prospect of widespread civilian casualties would only escalate the urgency for the Allies to respond with their own devastating capabilities. This leads to a harrowing question. Could a truce have been the final outcome if both sides were equipped with such catastrophic weapons? The presence of nuclear and chemical arsenals might have fostered a grim balance of terror, compelling both the Allies and Axis to reconsider their strategies and seek a cessation of hostilities before mutual destruction became an unavoidable reality. In conclusion, Spain's potential entry into World War II could have brought early advantages for the Axis, such as securing Gibraltar and disrupting Allied supply lines. However, these benefits would likely have been offset by the later costs of a drawn-out conflict, with Iberia becoming a battleground that drained resources from both sides. Ironically, Spain's involvement might have resulted in an even longer and more devastating war for all, raising the question of how close history came to this alternate path. Ultimately, we are left to ponder the profound impact of one nation's decisions on the fate of Europe.